The Roman soldiers standing on the battlefield of Cannae believed they were about to witness the end of a nightmare. For years, one man had challenged the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean. He had entered their lands, destroyed their armies, and survived every attempt designed to stop him. His name was Hannibal Barca, but on this day, Rome believed his story was finally coming to an end, because this time, Rome was not depending on luck. They were not sending a small force. They were sending one of the largest armies they had ever assembled, a force built with one purpose: to erase Hannibal's threat forever. From the Roman side, everything seemed obvious. They had more soldiers, they had more resources, they had the power of Rome behind them. Across the field stood an enemy commander, trapped deep inside hostile territory, far from his homeland, unable to replace his losses easily, surrounded by enemies. The Romans looked at the battlefield and believed they were seeing their greatest opportunity, but Hannibal saw something completely different. He did not see Rome's size as a problem. He saw it as a weapon he could use. Because Hannibal understood something that many commanders throughout history failed to realize. The greatest weakness of a powerful enemy is often hidden inside their greatest strength. When the battle started, Rome saw exactly what it expected. Thousands of Roman soldiers moved forward. Their heavy infantry crashed into Hannibal's line, and slowly, the enemy began to move backward. To the Romans, this was the moment they had waited for. Hannibal was finally breaking. The man who had embarrassed Rome for years was finally being pushed back, so they advanced. Again and again. Every step felt like progress. Every movement felt like proof that victory was getting closer. But there was something the Romans did not know. The battlefield was changing around them. The line they thought was collapsing was actually bending. The army they thought was escaping was slowly surrounding them. Because Hannibal was not trying to stop Rome's attack. He was guiding it. He had created a trap where every Roman success pushed them closer to disaster. And by the time they understood what was happening, the same army that marched forward expecting victory had nowhere left to go. This was not a battle decided by numbers. It was not a battle decided by strength. It was a battle decided by a commander who understood his enemy better than his enemy understood itself. So how did Hannibal convince one of the strongest armies in the ancient world to walk willingly into its own destruction? This is the genius trap Rome walked into. Before the trap at Cannae was created, Rome first had to face a problem it had never experienced before: a commander who refused to fight the way Rome expected. For centuries, Rome's power came from a simple but effective system: discipline, organization, persistence. Roman armies were not just groups of soldiers, they were machines built for war. Every soldier understood his position. Every formation had a purpose. Every defeat was treated as temporary. This was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Many civilizations could win battles, but Rome could survive losing them. If an army was destroyed, Rome created another. If a commander failed, Rome replaced him. Rome's enemies often discovered that defeating Roman soldiers was possible, but defeating Roman determination was much harder. And then came Hannibal, a commander who understood that fighting Rome's strength directly was exactly what Rome wanted, so he chose a different approach. He attacked the mind before attacking the army. He studied decisions, he studied emotions, he studied the patterns that controlled how his enemies reacted. Because Hannibal understood a simple idea: if you can predict what your enemy will choose, you can prepare for that choice before they even make it. And that made him extremely dangerous. Hannibal proved this before he ever reached the battlefield of Cannae. Rome believed its position was protected. Its enemies were expected to approach in predictable ways. Armies followed roads. They chose logical paths. They avoided impossible obstacles. But Hannibal understood that doing what an enemy expects gives them time to prepare. So he chose a path Rome did not believe an army would take. He crossed the dangerous mountains that separated his army from Italy, a journey many thought impossible. The crossing was brutal. The weather was unforgiving. The conditions destroyed part of his force before he even reached Roman territory, but strategically, the message was powerful. Hannibal had appeared where Rome never expected him. He had changed the rules of the war, and from that moment, Rome faced a commander who was difficult to predict. The battles that followed created a problem Rome was not used to. Hannibal kept winning. Not because his army was always stronger, not because every situation favored him, but because he understood how to create the situation he wanted. He knew when to attack. He knew when to wait. And most importantly, he knew how to make his enemies believe they were making their own decisions. Every defeat created more frustration inside Rome. Every loss increased the pressure. The question became more uncomfortable. How could one foreign commander continue surviving against the power of Rome? For the Roman people, this was not only a military problem, it became a matter of pride. Rome was supposed to be the force that adapted. Rome was supposed to be the power that eventually overcame every enemy. But Hannibal remained, and the longer he remained, the more Rome wanted a decisive answer. Some Roman leaders understood the danger. They believed patience was the solution. Avoid giving Hannibal the battle he wanted. Limit his options. Slowly weaken him. Because if Hannibal was dangerous when he could control the battlefield, then the answer was simple: do not give him that control. But patience is difficult when a nation feels humiliated. Waiting can look like fear. Caution can look like weakness. And Rome was tired of waiting. They wanted the moment where everything changed, a battle so large, so overwhelming, that even Hannibal's genius would not be enough. And that desire led Rome toward one of the biggest decisions in its history. They would gather an army unlike anything Hannibal had faced before. They believed they were creating the solution. But without knowing it, they were creating the exact opportunity Hannibal needed. In 216 BC, Rome prepared to finish the war. The idea behind their plan was simple. If Hannibal kept winning through strategy, then Rome would create a situation where strategy no longer mattered. They would overwhelm him. They would use their greatest advantage: numbers. The army Rome assembled was enormous. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers gathered under the Roman banners, rows of shields stretched across the battlefield, a force designed to move forward with unstoppable pressure. To Roman commanders, this made sense. Their infantry was their greatest weapon. A disciplined wall of soldiers that could break enemy formations through pure force. Against most enemies, that system worked. But Hannibal was not most enemies. He was not looking at the size of Rome's army. He was looking at how that size would behave. Because every advantage creates a weakness. A larger army has more power, but it also requires more control, more coordination, more space. And once a massive force begins moving in one direction, changing that direction becomes extremely difficult. The Romans believed they had created an unstoppable weapon. Hannibal saw a weapon he could redirect. Standing across from this enormous force, Hannibal understood the reality of his situation. He could not simply match Rome soldier for soldier. He could not depend on endless reinforcements. He could not afford a battle where both sides suffered the same losses. Rome could recover from destruction. Hannibal could not. So he needed more than a victory. He needed a perfect situation. A battle where Rome's own decisions would create the conditions for its defeat. And that required understanding what the Romans wanted most. They wanted Hannibal's army to break. They wanted to see his soldiers retreat. They wanted proof that after years of frustration, Rome's strength was finally enough. So Hannibal decided to give them exactly that. Most commanders prepare a battle plan around what they hope their own army can do. Hannibal prepared his plan around what he expected the enemy to do. He arranged his soldiers carefully. Every position had a purpose. Every movement was designed for what would happen later. The center of his army was placed forward. This was the place Rome would naturally attack. It was the obvious target, the weakness Rome wanted to see. But the most important part was not where his soldiers started. It was where they would move, because Hannibal's plan required something incredibly dangerous. He needed his center to bend, without breaking. If it collapsed too quickly, Rome would break through. If it resisted too strongly, Rome might stop advancing. Everything depended on balance. The retreat had to look real enough that Rome believed it was winning, but controlled enough that the trap survived. This is what separated Hannibal from ordinary commanders. Most leaders feared losing ground. They saw retreat as failure, but Hannibal understood that giving up space could create control. Sometimes moving backward forces your enemy exactly where you want them. The Romans would see weakness. They would see opportunity. They would see victory. But Hannibal would see something else. A massive army moving exactly where he needed it to go. And on the sides of his formation, another part of the plan waited. His experienced troops were positioned where they could eventually close inward. His cavalry prepared to influence the battlefield beyond the Roman center. The entire formation was designed like a machine, but it was a machine that only worked if Rome activated it, and Hannibal believed they would, because he was not guessing what Rome would do. He was counting on what years of studying Rome had taught him. They would attack, they would push forward, and they would believe they were winning. When the battle finally began, the Romans saw exactly what they expected. Their soldiers advanced. Thousands of men moved as one enormous force. The power of Rome moved directly toward Hannibal's center. From a distance, it looked unstoppable. And at first, everything went according to the Roman plan. Their infantry hit Hannibal's line. The pressure increased. The Carthaginian center started moving backward. Slowly, carefully, step by step. To the Roman soldiers pushing forward, there was only one explanation. The enemy was failing. After years of chasing Hannibal, after years of hearing about his victories, they were finally watching him lose. So they continued. They pushed deeper. They committed more strength. They followed the weakness Hannibal had created for them. But this was the dangerous part. The more successful Rome became, the more dangerous the situation became. Because every step forward changed the battlefield, and Rome did not realize the shape of the fight was no longer the same. At the beginning of the battle, the Roman army had space. It had organization. It had the ability to use the system that made it powerful. But as thousands of soldiers continued moving forward, that slowly began to change. The Roman formation became compressed. The soldiers at the front continued chasing what looked like a collapsing enemy. The soldiers behind them continued pushing forward. Everyone believed they were contributing to victory. But the same movement that created pressure was also removing flexibility. The army became deeper. The available space became smaller. And slowly, Rome's greatest strength began transforming into a weakness. Because an army is not powerful simply because it has thousands of soldiers. It is powerful because those soldiers can move, communicate, and react. Hannibal was taking those abilities away, not all at once, but step by step. While Rome focused on the center, the rest of Hannibal's plan continued. The sides of his army remained prepared. The soldiers who had waited patiently began moving into position. What started as a Roman attack against a weaker center was becoming something completely different. The battlefield itself was changing shape. The straight line became a curve. The curve became a pocket. And the pocket was beginning to close. But inside the Roman formation, many soldiers still did not understand what was happening. They had spent the entire battle moving forward. Everything they had seen suggested success. And that was the brilliance of Hannibal's design. The trap did not work because Rome ignored danger. The trap worked because the danger looked like victory. Then came the moment when the illusion disappeared. Roman soldiers who expected the enemy only in front of them started noticing movement from the sides. The pressure changed. The sounds of battle surrounded them. The army they thought was retreating was no longer moving away. It was closing in. And the terrifying realization began spreading through the formation. They had not broken Hannibal's army. They had entered it. The battlefield that looked like the place where Rome would finally win had become the place Hannibal had chosen for them to lose. By the time Rome understood the truth, the options were disappearing. A smaller mistake can sometimes be corrected. A commander can change a formation, move soldiers, create a new plan. But Hannibal had designed a situation where Rome discovered the problem too late. The size of the Roman army now worked against itself. Thousands of soldiers were packed together. The soldiers in the center had limited space. Orders became harder to communicate. Movement became almost impossible. The machine Rome had created had stopped functioning. This was not simply a physical trap, it was a psychological one. Hannibal had used Rome's expectations against them. The Romans expected aggression to solve the problem, so Hannibal rewarded their aggression. They expected forward movement to create victory, so Hannibal allowed them to move forward. They expected his retreat to mean weakness. So Hannibal made controlled retreat the most important part of his plan. Every Roman assumption became another piece of the trap. And that is why Cannae became one of the most famous examples of battlefield strategy in history. Because Hannibal did not win by avoiding Rome's power. He won by understanding it. He did not defeat Rome because Rome failed to use its strength. He defeated Rome because Rome used its strength exactly the way he expected. The same discipline, the same aggression, the same confidence that had built Rome into a great power had been predicted and controlled. The result at Cannae shocked the ancient world, not only because Rome lost. Rome had lost battles before. What made Cannae different was the way Rome lost. A force created to overwhelm Hannibal had been defeated by its own momentum. A battle designed to prove Roman strength had revealed the danger of becoming too predictable. And a commander with fewer resources had shown that understanding an enemy could sometimes matter more than matching an enemy. Hannibal had created something that commanders would study for thousands of years. The double envelopment, a strategy where an enemy is not only defeated from the front, but surrounded from every direction. Yet the formation itself was only part of the story. The real genius was everything that happened before it. The patience, the preparation, the ability to predict the decisions of another army. Because the final trap at Cannae did not begin when Hannibal's soldiers moved around the Romans. It began much earlier. It began when Hannibal understood what Rome wanted. Rome wanted a decisive victory. Rome wanted revenge. Rome wanted to prove that its power could not be challenged. And those desires shaped every decision. Hannibal did not need to force Rome into the trap. He only needed to create the conditions where Rome would choose to enter it. That is what made the strategy so effective. The Romans were not following Hannibal's orders. They were following their own instincts. But Hannibal already knew where those instincts would lead. The lesson of Cannae was not simply that smaller armies can defeat larger ones. History is full of examples where numbers matter, resources matter, strength matters. But Cannae showed something deeper. Power without understanding can become dangerous. Confidence without caution can become a weakness. And sometimes the moment an army feels closest to victory is the exact moment it becomes most vulnerable. The strategy behind Cannae is the reason battles are not only stories of weapons and soldiers, they are stories of decisions. One commander sees an opportunity. Another sees a danger. One army reacts to what is happening. Another controls what happens next. And those small differences can change history. If you enjoy discovering the hidden strategies and decisions that shaped the greatest moments in history, subscribe to Hidden Stratagem. Because every battle has a result everyone remembers. But behind that result is usually a decision, a mistake, or a strategy that changed everything. And Hannibal's greatest lesson was still not finished. Because winning the perfect battle did not mean he had won the war. After Cannae, many expected Rome to collapse. The defeat was enormous. The shock was unlike anything Rome had experienced. For many civilizations, a disaster of that size could have ended everything. A destroyed army, lost commanders, a population filled with fear. But Rome's greatest strength was never only the army standing on one battlefield. It was the system behind it. Rome could absorb losses that other nations could not. It could rebuild, it could adapt, and most importantly, it could learn. Hannibal had discovered how to defeat a Roman army. But defeating Rome itself was a much larger challenge, because Rome changed. Instead of giving Hannibal the massive, decisive battles he wanted, they became more patient. They adjusted their strategy. They understood that courage alone was not enough. A commander could be brave. An army could be powerful. A nation could have endless confidence. But if the enemy understands your decisions before you make them, you are already fighting at a disadvantage. This is why the story of Cannae became more complicated than a simple victory or defeat on the battlefield. Hannibal achieved something extraordinary. He created one of the most studied tactical victories in history. He showed that a smaller force with the right plan could overcome a much larger enemy. He proved that battles were not always decided by the number of soldiers standing in formation. They were decided by how those soldiers were used. But Rome proved something different. A single victory, even a brilliant one, does not always decide the future. Wars are not only tests of strategy, they are tests of endurance, adaptation, and the ability to recover after disaster. Centuries later, commanders continued studying the battlefield of Cannae, not because they wanted to copy every movement exactly. The world changed, weapons changed, armies changed, but the idea behind Hannibal's strategy remained powerful. Understand your enemy. Control their choices, make them react before they realize they are being guided. Because the greatest commanders in history rarely win only by asking, "What can my army do?" They ask a different question, "What will my enemy do?" And Hannibal answered that question before the battle even began. The Roman army walked onto the field, believing they had finally trapped their greatest enemy. They believed their numbers would decide the outcome. They believed their strength would end years of frustration. But Hannibal looked at that same strength and saw the path to victory. The Roman advance, the pressure, the confidence, the desire to finish the fight. Every piece became part of his design. Rome did not walk into the trap because it was weak. It walked into the trap because Hannibal understood exactly how a powerful enemy thinks. And that is what made Cannae unforgettable. The strongest weapon on that battlefield was not a sword. It was not a shield. It was not the size of an army. It was the ability to predict a decision before it happened. Rome entered the battle searching for Hannibal's weakness. But Hannibal had already found Rome's. This was the genius trap Rome walked into. If you enjoyed this story, leaving a like helps more history fans discover hidden stratagem. Subscribe for more stories about the decisions, strategies, and hidden moments that changed history. And tell us in the comments, which battle, commander, or military strategy should we uncover next?